Good evening. US President Donald Trump threatens to annihilate North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. This is the new axis of evil. Like a wounded dragon, the United States whips its tail across the planet and breathes fire on peoples, destroying countries, vanquishing enemies. Catastrophic natural events, hurricanes, and rising sea levels capture our imagination as the Caribbean islands are racked by wind and flood, and as the South Sea Islands disappear into the oceans. Data from international agencies show us that formal unemployment is an impossible dream for millions of our fellows on the planet. How to understand a world of unemployment and annihilation, of poverty, climate catastrophe, and war? What concepts do we have to grasp these complex realities? The modes of thought that come from North American positivism, game theory, regression analysis, multi-level models, inferential statistics, are at a loss to offer a general theory of our condition. Seeped in common sense understandings of power and naive about the role of elites in our world, these approaches might explain this or that aspect of our world. But can they explain the relationship between the endemic crisis produced by globalization, the failure of neoliberalism to manage this crisis, and the emergence of cruel populism as its current consensus? Do they have the concepts such as imperialism that are essential to an investigation of the real world that we live in and not the illusionary world dreamt up by the first principles of bourgeois social science, namely that the world is made up of individuals who are motivated by greed to get the best possible deal in every interaction? Do they have an explanation for why the countries of the world spend more money on the arsenal of repression than on the production of social goods? Why there are more police on our streets than social workers and artists? The word of explanation that I often hear is neoliberalism. It is the magic key. Scholars use it to explain everything. The enemy is Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. It is as if these leaders of the United States and the United Kingdom were like sorcerers, conjuring up public policy as if from nowhere, driving their agenda through the institutions of the planet. They championed the privatization of the protected commons and the cannibalization of social resources. This is what we consider to be neoliberalism. It was a magical moment. Technological developments, a flood of workers towards capital, and the creation of a new intellectual property regime produced the social force we call globalization. First, new technologies such as satellite communications, computerization, and container ships provided firms with the ability to manage global, real-time databases and to move goods as fast as possible short of teleportation. This meant that no longer did capital need to build factories near markets or to build one giant factory. The technological means to disarticulate production, to produce a commodity in several places, in other words, was now available. Second, barriers erected by the October Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the Third World Project began to tumble because of the debt crisis and the fall of the USSR. Millions of workers, previously sheltered from full-scale capitalist demands, now became prey to the capitalist market. They would wait the disarticulated factory in the name of the maquila to descend into their lives. Thirdly, capital went into the final round of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, to ensure that intellectual property rights would be in the hands of capital rather than civilization. Previously, intellectual property was in the process by which a good was produced, not in the good itself. That allowed people to find new ways to make goods and to therefore enhance science and technology. Now, GATT allowed the good itself to be patented, which means that capital can collect rent from anyone who makes this good, regardless of their innovations. It also means that the value of goods produced outside the core territory of capital, which is North America and Western Europe, will be protected by this new intellectual property system. This was the new legal framework of the architecture of disarticulated production. These technological developments, the delivery of millions of potential workers, and the new intellectual property rules allowed firms to operate on a global scale. They used two different strategies along the global commodity chain. First, they moved their entire production processes overseas to one country. This is known as foreign direct investment outsourcing. Here, the multinational firm would still have to invest money elsewhere to build up the physical infrastructure for production. Second, to produce their products, the multinational firms would merely hire subcontractors who would struggle against each other in a race to the bottom. This so-called arm's length outsourcing allowed multinational firms to save their capital and to bear almost no risk in the production process. Either way, by foreign direct investment or by arm's length outsourcing, capital found its advantage in labor arbitrage, using cheaper and weaker labor to make its products while hollowing out societies in the north and in the south. This new geography of production weakens the power of workers by removing the two institutional frameworks for the building of worker power: trade unions and nationalization. How can workers build unions in these arm's length subcontracted firms which are run on low margins by owners who use every brutal means to extract work from replaceable workers? How can states, if they are taken over by workers, nationalize parts of the production process if they do not control the entire process of the production of a commodity? This is why maquiladoras are the general description for the new production process along the global value chain. Arm's length outsourcing enables firms of the North to no longer invest their capital into the production process. Nike, Apple, and others like them do not invest money into factories. They are brand firms. The profits they make from the rent they gather against their brand is astronomical, and it does not get reinvested into productive enterprises. No wonder then that only 8 men hold as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. Their vast reserves go in two directions: finance or philanthropy, rather than into taxes. One of the most important concepts to consider in our times is that of the tax strike. Those who hold capital, who are the masters of property, have been essentially on strike against regimes of taxation. They use their vast wealth to either hide this money or change tax laws to offer them increasing protections. This vast pool of wealth is not used in any productive way. It is used to inflate the stock market and various asset bubbles. The turbulence that this can produce was shown in the 2007-2008 explosion of the largest asset bubble to burst as of yet, the US housing market. This tax strike has also created a morbid cult of philanthropy, with the rich donor now the hero of our times. And it has created a well-paid army of lobbyists who ensure that democracy is in chains without the necessity of a military coup. Tax strikes come alongside the insistence that public officials must balance the books of public finances. Governments must balance their budgets even as capital reduces its payments into the public exchequer. This means that governments are forced to either sell assets to raise funds so as to continue to maintain social institutions, or else they slice away at these social goods. Fiscal responsibility alongside the tax strike means impoverished government finances. No wonder then that the pressure on society is now defrayed from the state onto society. What the hidden hand destroyed, as economist Nancy Folber showed, the hidden heart had to hold together. The social costs of globalization frayed society, whose loose bonds had to be held together by triple-time labor, mainly from women in families. Modern states, with commitments won by their population through sustained struggle, could not immediately cut all social benefits. Childcare, education, transportation, fresh air, welfare pensions, All these the people had forced their states to provide. These were part of the minimum definition of modern civilization. The tax strike and fiscal responsibility desiccated public budgets. They simply could not find the means to deliver upon their obligations. Dearly won public assets and non-commodified parts of nature went on the auction block. This privatization raised funds to maintain the tenuous finances of the modern state. International entities such as the International Monetary Fund and commercial banks punished states that did not cut deep enough into their public finances, downgrading their bonds, preventing them from raising short-term capital to protect them from the spiral into insolvency. The money raised from privatization was rarely used to invest in infrastructure or production to enhance the social wealth and to broaden the skills of the population. Instead, young people and cashiered older workers were forced to pay for their education through debt, as this education was promised as the avenue for individual advancement. Ideas of the community or of society, as well as workers, began to wither. We see workers called colleagues or members of a team, a false horizontality in a deeply vertical world. How was the economy to grow? Neoliberal policy bet on letting loose the animal spirits of consumerism, paid for through debt, and from the creation of new technologies and assets that would miraculously increase growth rates and produce social wealth that could be somehow spent on social goods. None of this happened. Instead, consumerism and the emergence of new technologies led to debt, and the inflated assets led to more turbulence of the global economy, a derivative civilization, a civilization founded on trickery and theft. To make the economy grow, ordinary people had to go into debt. The data on poverty in our times is utterly miserable. Let's begin with the fact that 22,000 children die every day from poverty. Every 10 seconds, a child dies of hunger. About half of the world's population live on less than $2.50 per day. Household debt has risen astronomically, which implicates the middle class into a debt-driven consumption pattern. There are miserable implications for this data. The fact that global wealth, drawn from the exploitation of social labor, has been sequestered by very small numbers of people, and that the amelioration of suffering of a very large number of people will be sporadic and insufficient. Older categories that have been set aside by social science, such as humiliation, frustration, desolation, alienation, anger, will be needed if we are to understand the condition in the planet of slums. Rather than fight to break the tax strike, the governments of the world turn their energy toward corralling the masses through devices of great ingenuity, a war on drugs, a war on terror, with new vocabulary to suggest the inevitability of the new mechanisms of control, security, surveillance, risk mitigation, sensitivity analysis, hazards. Social wealth that could be used to overcome poverty is now moved increasingly to build up the arsenal of security. A report last year from the Institute for Economics and Peace showed that the total cost of violence per year is now $13.6 trillion, with half of this, about $6.5 trillion, going to military expenditure, and a quarter of this, or $3.5 trillion, going to internal security. The total cost of violence amounts to 13.3% of the world's gross domestic product. Since the stated commission for official development aid is merely 0.7% of gross domestic product, and the total cost of violence is 13.3%, this discrepancy between aid and violence shows that the market has failed. Neoliberal policy, which is essentially starvation of the social side of state policy and the indulgence of the military side of state policy, has little answer to the widening inequality gap and the deepening sense of despair that grips large parts of the planet. Guns intimidate people, but they do not provide them with any hope for a better future. Fixation on Donald Trump is a natural instinct. He is the most bellicose of the strong men, a long line that runs from the Philippines' Duterte through India's Modi to Turkey's Erdogan. Of these men, Trump is in charge of the most powerful state with vast military capabilities and with its power coursing through the institutions of international finance and diplomacy. Trump and the European neo-fascists provide a muted opposition to neoliberalism. They do not oppose neoliberal policy in any direct way, since they remain committed to policies to increase economic growth and to policies that curtail the social ways. Substantial critiques of globalization are not to be found at the policy level, but only at the rhetorical or political level. It is here, in speeches before their constituencies, that Trump and the Euro-fascists gesture toward policies of economic sovereignty. They grumble about job loss and about trade policies, but like neoliberalism, they have no real alternative to globalization. They are trapped by its material contradictions. Immense profits harnessed by multinational corporations that feed the financial structure, while great misery for the mass of the world's population, who produce the social wealth to which they seem to have no claim. What the neo-fascists or the cruel populists promise is much weaker than either economic sovereignty structured around nation states or the working class. Their rhetoric sparkles with economic nationalism, but in fact, their policy provisions are stuck at the border of cultural nationalism. They obsess over a fantasy of cultural homogeneity, a Europe without minarets and hijabs, the United States without Mexicans. Anti-immigrant sentiment is the platform of their nationalism. Trade ceases to be about the principles of exchange and becomes increasingly about racism. There is little serious conversation here about how increased productivity rates in the West, driven by technology, has been the cause of job loss. Trade has played only a marginal role in the hemorrhaging of white-collar jobs. Serious economic discussion is by the wayside as the antidote to suffering is suffocated by Build the Wall and Muslim ban, slogans of great meaning to those who are hurt by them, but with little meaning for those who suffer economic insecurity. This is the cruelty of the neo-fascists and the populists. The neo-fascists and the populists are under no compulsion to mark their belligerence, to hide behind phrases such as humanitarian intervention or security. They believe in violence and want to use it in allopathic doses to maintain their domination. Calls for recolonization come alongside calls for the theft of natural resources. Their wars, internal and external, are the prophylaxis against the failure of their fantasy of cultural sovereignty. They cannot make a world of cultural homogeneity, so they use force to intimidate those who are seen as foreigners, as outsiders, as lesser human beings. What remains before us? Across the planet, there are many strong and powerful movements of the people, labor struggles and dignity struggle, fights to defend the right to natural resources, and fights to defend the rights to one's body. These are the main avenues of resistance to the powerful, but they are deeply weakened on two fronts. First, they are largely isolated from each other, and second, there is no captivating horizon of the future that animates all these struggles. Defensiveness is the order of the day. One of our tasks as intellectuals is to learn from these movements, to see what kinds of alternatives they propose, and to build these gestures into a full-fledged theory of the future. If we look closely at these movements, we will find that they want to bring macroeconomic policy under democratic control. They want to increase social wages. They want to build infrastructure to attend to popular needs. They want to break the tax strike of corporations and the elite. They want to convert banks from private entities into utilities. They want to ensure a livelihood for everyone and for housing for all. In this are elements of a future. But we have, as intellectuals, to also recover the idea of the future. There is no debate that there once was a past and that we live in the present. But there is a debate about the future. We know that tomorrow will come, and the day after that, and then next month, and then next year. But this is seen as merely sequential time, as the present stretching outward. But this is not the idea of the future. The idea of the future requires us to imagine that the present is not going to be eternal. Transformations are possible. New solutions to current problems are necessary. New horizons must be built. Our movements give us an indicator of these horizons. We have to make sure our social sciences are not dulled into the cynicism of the impossible. 30 million people are currently on the threshold of famine. They would like to flee toward food and away from drought, forest fire, and war. Squeezed between the end of livelihood and the refusal to allow migration, the world's poor experience punishment for a crime that is unknown. What did they do to deserve their fate? Why are they being punished when they have not committed a crime? Thanks a lot.